One of the most misunderstood dynamics in a relationship with a narcissistic personality is the role that attention plays. Many people believe conflict is what keeps the connection alive, but psychologically speaking, it is not conflict that feeds a narcissist. It is emotional engagement. Whether the emotion is love, anger, frustration, or the need to explain yourself, all of it gives them something they depend on. Their sense of control is built on the belief that they can reach inside you and create a reaction whenever they want. The moment you react, even if you think you are defending yourself, the dynamic stays exactly the way they need it to stay. This is why silence becomes so powerful. Not the kind of silence that comes from fear, and not the silence that hides resentment, but a deliberate, grounded silence that comes from understanding. When you stop arguing, stop over-explaining, and stop trying to make them see your side, you remove the stage they are used to standing on. For a narcissistic mind, this feels deeply unsettling. They are accustomed to pulling emotional strings and watching you move. When the strings no longer work, they are forced to face something they try very hard to avoid: their lack of real control. From a psychological point of view, people who rely on narcissistic defenses often carry a fragile inner structure. On the outside, they may appear confident, dominant, even superior, but underneath there is a constant need for reassurance that they matter, that they are important, that they still have influence. They look for that reassurance in the reactions of others. If you become upset, they feel powerful. If you try to prove yourself to them, they feel superior. If you keep explaining, they feel necessary. Your reaction becomes the mirror that protects their self-image. So when you choose silence, you are not playing a game. You are stepping out of a system that was never healthy to begin with. Silence breaks the pattern because it removes the emotional feedback they depend on. And when that feedback disappears, the narcissistic mind often becomes restless. They may try harder to provoke you. They may become charming again. They may act confused, angry, or even wounded. All of these reactions have the same purpose: to pull you back into the cycle where they feel safe and in control. What makes this difficult is that many people feel guilty when they stop reacting. You may feel like you are being cold, or unfair, or disrespectful. But in reality, what you are doing is protecting your psychological space. Not every situation deserves an explanation. Not every accusation deserves a defense. And not every person has earned access to your emotions. Learning this is not cruelty. It is maturity. Silence, when it comes from self-respect, is not weakness. It is clarity. It means you no longer need to prove who you are to someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. It means you are no longer willing to trade your peace for the temporary relief of being heard by someone who was never really listening. And for a narcissistic personality, this kind of silence feels like torture, not because you are hurting them, but because they can no longer use you to avoid themselves. Over time, this changes the balance completely. The person who once controlled the emotional temperature of the relationship begins to lose that power. They cannot predict you the same way. They cannot pull the same reactions. And without those reactions, their usual strategies stop working. This is why calm, steady silence is often more effective than any argument you could ever make. In the end, the real shift happens the moment you understand that not every battle needs to be fought, and not every voice deserves an answer. When you stop reacting to what is meant to control you, you take back the only thing a narcissistic dynamic ever tried to take from you: your inner freedom. And once you have that, silence is no longer empty, it becomes strength. Another shift begins to happen when you start setting boundaries without guilt. This sounds simple when we say it, but psychologically, it is one of the hardest things for many people to do, especially if they have spent years in a relationship where their role was to keep the peace, to explain, to adjust, and to make sure the other person never felt challenged. In a narcissistic dynamic, the expectation is not equality. The expectation is access. Unlimited access to your time, your attention, your patience, and often even your identity. And the longer this pattern continues, the more normal it starts to feel, even when it is quietly exhausting you. A boundary disrupts this pattern because a boundary says there is a line that cannot be crossed, even if the other person does not like it. For someone with healthy emotional development, A boundary may feel uncomfortable, but it can still be understood. For someone who relies on narcissistic defenses, a boundary often feels like rejection, disrespect, or even betrayal. Not because the boundary is wrong, but because it removes the sense of entitlement they have become used to. When they can no longer assume they will always get a response, always get an explanation, always get your time, something inside them feels threatened. This is why the reaction to boundaries can be so intense. You may notice anger, sarcasm, guilt tripping, or sudden attempts to make you feel selfish. These reactions are not random. They are attempts to restore the old balance where your role was to accommodate and their role was to decide. When you begin to say no, when you begin to limit how much you give, the system stops working the way it used to. And whenever a system changes, the people who benefited from the old one often resist the most. Many people struggle here because they confuse kindness with self-abandonment. They believe that being a good person means always being available, always being understanding, always giving another chance. But real psychological health does not come from having no limits. It comes from knowing where your responsibility ends and where another person's responsibility begins. Without that clarity, relationships slowly turn into roles, and those roles become prisons that nobody talks about openly. Setting a boundary without guilt means you accept that the other person may not like your decision, and you allow that discomfort to exist without rushing to fix it. This is not easy, especially if you learned early in life that love depends on keeping others happy. When that belief lives inside you, every boundary feels like a risk. You may feel anxiety, doubt, even fear that the relationship will fall apart. But sometimes what falls apart is not the relationship itself, only the illusion that you had to lose yourself to keep it. For a narcissistic personality, this change can feel like torture, not because you are attacking them, but because you are no longer playing the role that kept them comfortable. They may say you have changed. They may say you are becoming cold, difficult, or selfish. In reality, what they are noticing is that you are no longer as easy to control. And when control disappears, the dynamic has to change. Healthy boundaries do not require shouting long explanations or emotional arguments. In fact, the more grounded you are, the simpler your words become. Sometimes a boundary is just a calm no. Sometimes it is choosing not to respond immediately. Sometimes it is deciding that you will not discuss the same issue again and again. These small moments may not look dramatic from the outside, but psychologically they are very powerful, because they show that your sense of self no longer depends on the other person's approval. Over time, something important begins to happen inside you. The guilt becomes quieter. The fear becomes smaller. And the space you create with your boundaries starts to feel less like distance and more like freedom. You realize that you can care about someone without giving them unlimited power over your emotions. You realize that respect is not something you earn by sacrificing yourself. It is something you protect by knowing your limits. And when you reach that point, the dynamic changes in a way that no argument could ever achieve. Because the moment you can say no without guilt, you stop being someone who can be controlled by pressure, by drama, or by the fear of losing approval. You become someone who chooses, instead of someone who reacts, and that is often the moment when the balance of power finally shifts. Another important turning point in this dynamic comes when you stop seeking their approval. This may sound like a small internal change, but psychologically it is one of the most powerful shifts you can make. In a narcissistic relationship, approval becomes a kind of currency. You start to feel that things are calm only when they are pleased, when they agree with you, or when they give you some sign that you are doing the right thing. Without realizing it, you begin to organize your behavior around their reactions. You choose your words carefully, you explain yourself more than necessary, and sometimes you even doubt your own judgment, just because they seem so certain about theirs. From the outside, this can look like respect or compromise, but inside it often comes from something deeper: the fear of disapproval. Many people who find themselves in these dynamics have a history of needing validation in order to feel safe or accepted. If at some point in life, approval was connected to love, then losing approval can feel like losing connection itself. A narcissistic personality, consciously or unconsciously, senses this very quickly. They learn that if they act disappointed, distant, or critical, you will try harder. And the harder you try, the more power they feel they have. The problem is that approval from a narcissistic mind is rarely stable. One day you may feel appreciated, the next day criticized for the same thing. This inconsistency is not always intentional, but it keeps you in a state of emotional dependence. You keep looking for that moment when they will finally say, "Now it's enough. Now you are right. Now you are good." And because that moment never lasts, the cycle continues. You stay engaged, you stay invested, and they remain at the center of your emotional world. When you begin to stop seeking their approval, the balance starts to change in a way that can feel uncomfortable at first. You may notice how often you want to explain yourself, how often you want them to understand why you did something, or why you feel the way you feel. There is a natural human desire to be seen and recognized. The difficulty is that in a narcissistic dynamic, that desire can turn into a trap. The more you need them to validate you, the more influence they have over how you see yourself. Letting go of that need does not mean you stop caring about the relationship. It means your sense of worth is no longer decided by their reaction. You begin to trust your own perception even when they disagree. You make decisions without waiting for their approval first. You speak without feeling the need to justify every detail. These changes may look small, but psychologically they send a very different message. They show that your identity is no longer built around keeping them satisfied. For someone who depends on feeling superior or needed, this can be deeply unsettling. They may try to pull you back into the old pattern by questioning your choices, criticizing your attitude, or acting as if you are making a mistake. Sometimes they may even become more charming for a while, offering the approval you used to wait for, just to see if you will return to the same role. This is not always done with full awareness, but the effect is the same. The system tries to restore itself. What keeps the change real is consistency. When you stop chasing approval, you also stop arguing about every disagreement. You allow them to have their opinion without feeling that you must change it. You allow yourself to move forward without needing them to confirm that you are right. This does not create distance because of anger. It creates distance because of clarity. And clarity often feels threatening to someone who is comfortable when you are unsure of yourself. Over time, the emotional weight begins to lift. You realize how much energy was spent trying to be understood by someone who was never really listening in the way you hoped. You realize that self-respect grows quietly when it no longer depends on someone else's permission. And perhaps most importantly, you see that the moment you stop asking for approval, you stop giving away the authority you always had over your own life. In the end, the real freedom comes when you understand that not everyone you love has the right to define you. When your decisions no longer depend on their validation, the control they once had begins to disappear. And the moment you can stand in your own judgment without needing their agreement is the moment the dynamic finally starts to lose its hold on you. As the dynamic continues to change, another moment of real power appears when you learn to stay calm while they are trying to trigger you. This is often the point where many people feel the most challenged, because provocation is one of the strongest tools in a narcissistic pattern of interaction. The reaction itself becomes the goal. It is not always about the topic being discussed, and it is not always about solving a problem. Very often, the real purpose of the conversation is to create an emotional response strong enough to pull you back into the old role where you feel the need to defend, explain, or prove yourself. When someone knows which words make you angry, which accusations make you feel guilty, or which tones make you feel small, those buttons can be pressed again and again. Sometimes this happens openly through criticism or sarcasm. Sometimes it happens in more subtle ways, through confusion, denial, or changing the story just enough to make you question your own memory. Psychologically, this creates instability inside you, and that instability gives the other person a sense of control. If they can change your emotional state whenever they want, they feel powerful, even if they are not aware that this is what they are doing. This is why calmness becomes so disruptive to the pattern. When you stay steady instead of reacting, the usual sequence stops working. They say something meant to upset you, and instead of arguing, you respond with very little emotion, or sometimes with no response at all. To someone who expects a strong reaction, this can feel confusing, even irritating. They may repeat the point, raise their voice, or bring up something from the past, hoping to get the response they are used to. But the more grounded you remain, the more the interaction begins to lose its intensity. Staying calm does not mean you agree with what is being said, and it does not mean you accept disrespect. It means you no longer allow another person to decide what happens inside your nervous system. This is a very different kind of strength. It is not loud, and it does not try to win the argument. It simply refuses to participate in a fight that has no real purpose. When you reach this point, you start to see how many conversations were never about understanding in the first place. They were about control, about dominance, about keeping you emotionally engaged. From a psychological perspective, people who rely on narcissistic defenses often feel uncomfortable with emotional neutrality because they experience it as distance. If they cannot make you angry, they may try to make you feel guilty. If guilt does not work, they may try to make you feel responsible. And if that does not work either, they may act as if you have become cold or uncaring. These reactions are attempts to restore the emotional intensity that used to keep the connection alive. But when your calmness is real, not forced, you do not need to argue about these accusations. You simply remain where you are, without moving back into the old pattern. What makes this difficult is that staying calm requires you to tolerate discomfort. Your body may still want to react. You may feel the urge to correct every false statement, to defend every misunderstanding, to show them that they are wrong. That urge is natural, especially if you have spent a long time feeling unheard. But every time you resist the impulse to react immediately, you strengthen a different part of yourself. The part that can choose how to respond instead of being pulled into automatic emotion. Over time, this changes the balance more than any explanation ever could. The person who once knew exactly how to get a reaction from you starts to feel uncertain. The same words no longer have the same effect. The same arguments no longer go in the same circles. And without that predictable reaction, the sense of control begins to fade. This is often experienced by the narcissistic mind as frustration, because the strategy that worked for so long suddenly stops producing the same result. The real shift happens when your calmness is no longer something you perform, but something you feel. When you no longer need to win every conversation, when you no longer need them to admit they are wrong, and when your peace becomes more important than being understood in that moment, the dynamic changes at its core. You stop being someone who can be pulled into chaos on demand, and you become someone who decides when and how to engage. And in the end, that is what makes calmness so powerful. When another person can no longer control your emotions, they lose the strongest leverage they ever had. The moment you can stay steady in the face of provocation is the moment the cycle begins to break, because control only works when it finds a reaction. Another change begins to take place when your focus slowly moves away from the narcissist and returns to your own growth. This sounds almost obvious when we say it, but in reality, many people spend years in relationships where most of their mental energy is directed toward understanding the other person, calming the other person, fixing the other person, or trying to predict what the other person will do next. Without noticing it, your life starts to revolve around their moods, their reactions, and their approval. Your attention becomes centered on managing the relationship instead of developing yourself. From a psychological point of view, this shift of attention is not accidental. In a narcissistic dynamic, the other person often needs to remain the central figure in order to feel secure. When the focus stays on them, they feel important, influential, and in control of the emotional atmosphere. But the moment your attention turns inward, toward your own goals, your own healing, and your own direction, the balance begins to change. It is not that you are attacking them, and it is not that you are trying to prove anything. It is simply that your life is no longer organized around their needs. This can be surprisingly difficult, especially if you have learned to measure your worth through how much you give to others. Many people who stay in these dynamics for a long time are not weak. In fact, they are often very empathetic, very patient, and very willing to work on themselves. The problem is that this strength gets used in only one direction. Instead of building their own life, they keep investing their energy into making the relationship work, even when the effort is not returned in the same way. Over time, this creates exhaustion, confusion, and a quiet feeling that you are losing yourself without knowing exactly when it started. Focusing on your own growth interrupts this pattern. You begin to ask different questions. Instead of asking, how do I make them understand me? You start asking, what do I need in order to feel whole? Instead of asking, why are they like this? You ask, what kind of life do I want to build, regardless of how they behave? These questions may seem simple, but psychologically they move your center of gravity back to where it belongs. Your identity becomes less dependent on the relationship and more connected to your own values, your own interests, and your own sense of direction. For someone who depends on feeling superior or needed, this change can feel threatening. When you begin to grow, you become less predictable. You may have less time for the same arguments, less patience for the same drama, and less interest in proving yourself. Sometimes the narcissistic reaction to this is subtle, and sometimes it is very direct. They may minimize your progress, question your decisions, or act as if your new priorities are selfish. This is not always done with full awareness, but it often comes from the same place. The fear of losing influence over you. What makes personal growth so powerful in this context is that it cannot be controlled by someone else. When you learn new skills, when you build confidence, when you strengthen your emotional awareness, you create a life that does not depend on their approval to exist. The more solid you feel inside, the less you need constant reassurance from outside. And when that need disappears, the old dynamic begins to lose its hold. It is important to understand that focusing on yourself is not revenge. It is not about showing them what they lost, and it is not about making them jealous. If those become the motivation, you are still tied to the same system, only in a different way. Real growth happens when your attention is no longer fixed on their reaction at all. You are not improving to prove something. You are improving because your life deserves to move forward. Over time, this creates a kind of quiet distance that no argument could ever create. The person who once felt like the center of your world becomes only one part of it. Their approval matters less. Their criticism hurts less. Their attempts to pull you back into the old pattern feel less convincing. Not because they changed, but because you did. Your energy is no longer available for the same cycle. And in the end, this is what makes personal growth so difficult for a narcissistic dynamic to tolerate. When you become focused on your own life, your own healing, and your own direction, you stop feeding the system that depended on your attention. The moment your energy starts building your future, instead of maintaining the old pattern, is the moment the control begins to disappear, and that is often when real freedom quietly begins. The final shift, and often the most difficult one to accept, comes when you become truly ready to walk away. Not as a threat, not as a way to force change, and not as a dramatic reaction in the middle of an argument, but as a real internal decision that you are capable of living without the connection, if the connection continues to cost you your peace. In many narcissistic dynamics, the unspoken belief that keeps the pattern alive is the assumption that no matter what happens, you will stay. As long as that belief exists, the system has no real reason to change. Words may be said, promises may be made, but at a deeper psychological level, nothing shifts because your presence is still guaranteed. When you reach the point where you know you can leave if necessary, something inside you reorganizes. Your choices are no longer driven only by fear of losing the relationship. You begin to see the situation more clearly, without the same pressure to keep everything together at any cost. This clarity can feel uncomfortable at first, because it forces you to face questions you may have avoided for a long time. You may start to notice how much you tolerated, how often you explained things that should not have needed explanation, how many times you hoped that understanding would change a pattern that never really changed. From a psychological perspective, being ready to walk away does not mean you stop caring. It means your sense of self is no longer dependent on the other person staying the same. Many people remain stuck in painful dynamics because they believe that leaving would mean failure, or that enduring everything proves loyalty, patience, or love. But endurance without limits is not always strength. Sometimes it is the result of believing that you do not have the right to choose a life that feels healthier. For someone with strong narcissistic defenses, the idea that you might truly leave can feel deeply threatening. Not because they always want the relationship to end, but because the possibility of losing control over the situation challenges the image they have of themselves. They may respond by becoming more attentive for a while, or by trying to convince you that you are overreacting, or even by turning the situation around and acting as if they are the one who has been wronged. These reactions are often attempts to bring the dynamic back to a place where your decision depends on their response. What changes everything is when your readiness to walk away is quiet and real. You are not trying to scare them, and you are not waiting for them to stop you. You simply know that your well-being does not have to be negotiated forever. This kind of certainty is very different from anger. Anger still keeps you emotionally tied to the situation. Clarity allows you to step back without needing the other person to agree with your reasons. It is also important to understand that walking away does not always mean physically leaving immediately. Sometimes it begins as an emotional shift. You stop investing the same energy in arguments that never end. You stop trying to fix what only the other person can take responsibility for. You allow yourself to imagine a future that is not built around managing their behavior. This alone can change the dynamic more than any confrontation, because it removes the silent guarantee that you will always stay no matter what happens. Over time, this readiness creates a different kind of strength. You no longer feel trapped by the fear of losing the relationship, and because of that, your decisions become more honest. You can set boundaries without panic. You can stay calm without pretending. You can focus on your growth without waiting for permission. And if the relationship cannot exist without control, guilt, or constant emotional pressure, you know that leaving is not destruction. It is a form of self-respect. In the end, the greatest power you have in any relationship is the knowledge that you can choose what you allow in your life. When another person realizes that your presence is no longer guaranteed, the balance changes in a way that no argument can create. And the moment you understand that you are able to walk away without losing yourself is the moment you stop being controlled by the fear of being alone and start living with the freedom of knowing that your peace is worth protecting.